I stood at the Delta check-in counter at the international terminal, feeling a rare sense of genuine excitement. As a forensic accountant and certified fraud examiner, my daily life revolves around tracing dirty money, exposing corporate embezzlement, and analyzing thousands of pages of dense financial records. It is an incredibly cynical profession. You spend enough time looking at the dark side of human greed, dissecting the ways people lie to steal from each other, and you start to see every interaction as a potential transaction. You learn to look for the hidden motives behind every smile and the unwritten clauses in every handshake. But today was supposed to be completely different. Today was supposed to be a celebration, a temporary ceasefire in the endless war of numbers and deceit. My private financial intelligence firm had just concluded its most profitable quarter in our entire 5-year history, and I was finally ready to step away from the glowing screens and endless spreadsheets. I needed this break. My mind was exhausted from the constant vigilance my career demanded. The terminal around me buzzed with the frantic, chaotic energy of thousands of travelers dragging oversized luggage and checking brightly lit departure boards. I held my navy blue passport tightly in my hand, feeling the physical weight of the journey ahead. I had spent exactly $30,000 booking a 2-week luxury Mediterranean cruise for my family. It was an astronomical sum, but it was supposed to be a bonding experience, a desperate chance for all of us to reconnect after a highly stressful year. I had meticulously planned every single detail. I booked premium ocean view staterooms for my parents, Michelle and Robert, wanting them to experience the kind of effortless luxury they constantly pretended to have. I even secured a massive luxury suite for my older brother Caleb and his wife, Olivia. I arranged for private guided excursions in Greece and Italy, booking exclusive tours of ancient ruins and securing reservations at high-end restaurants. I was hoping to create the kind of normal, joyful family memories we never seemed to have. I wanted, just for 14 days, to be a regular son and a regular brother, rather than the family bank account. I was next in line to check my heavy leather travel bags when my phone chimed loudly with a text message notification. I pulled the device from my pocket, fully expecting a standard logistical message from my mother. I assumed she was asking where we should meet near the departure gate or complaining about the length of the security lines. Instead, the text from Michelle read, "You are not coming. Robert wants just family. Caleb needs this. We gave your ticket to Olivia's sister." I stood perfectly still, staring at the glowing screen. My highly trained analytical brain tried to process the sheer mathematical impossibility and the profound cruelty of those specific words. Just family. I was her flesh and blood. I was her son. I was the one who had carefully planned the entire complex itinerary over the past 6 months, sacrificing my rare weekends to ensure every transfer and hotel booking was flawless. I was the one who had paid for every single aspect of this luxury vacation directly from my own corporate accounts. How could I suddenly, at the very last possible second, not be considered family? The absolute audacity of giving my premium, non-refundable ticket to my sister-in-law's sister was staggering. A woman I had met exactly twice in my entire life, someone who did not even know my middle name, was currently preparing to board a luxury ship on my dime, while I stood completely abandoned at the airport. I did not scream. I did not drop to my knees and cry like a dramatic character in a movie. Years of investigating high-level corporate fraud physically train you to detach your emotions when presented with shocking data. When you uncover a massive embezzlement scheme, you do not throw a tantrum. You simply observe the anomaly, verify the hard facts, and prepare your devastating countermeasure. I took a deep, steadying breath. I stepped out of the check-in line, completely ignoring the annoyed sighs and grumbles of the impatient passengers behind me. I walked away from the ticketing desk and headed over to a quiet corner near a terminal coffee shop. I needed to hear it directly from them. I immediately dialed my mother's number. It rang 3 times before someone answered. But it was not my mother. It was my 37-year-old brother, Caleb. He laughed loudly into the receiver over the distinct background noise of the busy airport VIP lounge, a lounge I had explicitly paid for. "Well, if it is not the workaholic human calculator," Caleb said, his voice dripping with intense, unearned condescension. What do you want, Arthur? We are about to board the plane, and the complimentary champagne here is actually decent. I demanded to know exactly what was going on, and why my mother had sent that horrific text message just moments before I was scheduled to check my bags. Caleb sighed loudly into the phone, the sound carrying a heavy layer of theatrical exhaustion, as if I was being an unbearable nuisance interrupting his highly important schedule. Look, Arthur, you need to stop acting so incredibly entitled right now. Olivia's sister really needed a vacation. She has been going through a hard time with her personal life, and frankly, she is much more fun to be around than you. You always bring the mood down with your constant talk about audits, tax law, and corporate responsibility. I paid $30,000 for this trip, I said, my voice maintaining a low, dangerous equilibrium. I did not raise my pitch. I did not let him hear a single ounce of pain. You cannot just give away a ticket that I purchased with my own hard-earned money to a complete stranger without even having the basic decency to call me. Caleb scoffed loudly, the sound echoing sharply through the phone speaker. Your hard-earned money. Please, Arthur. You just sit in an air-conditioned office and look at boring spreadsheets all day. It is not like you have a real job that contributes anything innovative or revolutionary to society. I am launching a massive cryptocurrency firm next month, and I desperately need this trip to decompress before the big launch. You know how stressful the tech startup world is. The mental load is immense. You should be supporting my mental health and my vision instead of throwing a massive tantrum at the check-in counter like a spoiled child. I stood in the airport concourse, barely able to comprehend his deep, unshakable delusion. Caleb was a perpetual failure who constantly called himself a visionary tech founder but had never actually built a successful company in his entire 37 years of life. Every single venture he touched went bankrupt within a year, usually leaving a trail of furious investors and unpaid vendors. And now, this parasite was lecturing me about hard work and innovation while standing in a premium departure lounge that I had funded. Before I could methodically dismantle his absurd claims, I heard scuffling on the other end of the line. My mother, Michelle, snatched the phone from him. Her tone was sharp, aggressive, and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. Arthur, you need to calm down and stop making a scene right this instant, Michelle snapped, her voice carrying that familiar, toxic edge of absolute authority. You have plenty of money sitting in your corporate accounts. You can go to Europe anytime you want. Your brother desperately needs this relaxation to prepare for his new launch. He has been under so much extreme pressure lately trying to build a lasting legacy for this family name. I reminded her, keeping my voice incredibly flat and devoid of emotion, that she had literally just texted me that I was not family. Do not twist my words to play the victim, Arthur, Michelle replied smoothly, instantly deploying her favorite gaslighting tactic. Your father and I just wanted a peaceful, stress-free family vacation without you constantly reminding us how much everything costs. You are always so focused on the price tag instead of the experience. We are keeping the ticket. Do not call us again until we get back from our trip. The line went completely dead. The dial tone buzzed in my ear for a few seconds before I lowered the phone slowly. I stood in the middle of the bustling terminal, and a cold, absolute clarity washed over me like freezing water. I realized then, with absolute mathematical certainty, that they would never see me as a son. I was just a convenient automatic teller machine to them, a bottomless source of funding required to sustain their delusions and cater to their beloved golden child. At that exact moment, I wondered how many people listening to this have also been drained dry by relatives who viewed their hard work as a communal resource. Before I continue this story, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you are living in right now. Every single comment helps this video reach a wider audience. Thank you very much. I turned my luggage cart around, found a quiet, secluded table at the terminal cafe, and opened my laptop. I securely logged into the cruise line portal. My corporate credit card was linked to every single stateroom on their reservation. With a few simple keystrokes, I completely revoked the payment authorization for Michelle, Robert, Caleb, and Olivia. I canceled the premium unlimited drink packages. I canceled the private guided tours in Rome. I removed my credit card entirely from their guest profiles. Once they boarded that massive ship, they would have absolutely $0 attached to their room keys. Let them enjoy Europe on their own dime. Let us see how they enjoy the luxury of Europe with $0 to their names, I thought to myself as I firmly closed the cruise line portal. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, feeling significantly lighter than I had in many years. The toxic, suffocating cord tying me to their endless entitlement had finally been severed by their own blatant, unapologetic greed. I packed my heavy laptop away into my leather briefcase and prepared to call a premium car service to take me back to my quiet downtown apartment. I planned to spend the next 2 weeks enjoying the empty city, ordering takeout from my favorite local restaurants, and completely freeing myself from the exhausting burden of managing my family's fabricated dramas. I was ready to embrace the profound peace of complete detachment. But my moment of peaceful clarity was abruptly and violently interrupted. My cell phone vibrated heavily against the small wooden cafe table. It was an urgent, red alert push notification from my premium property management application. I picked up the device, opened the secure app, and stared at the alert in utter confusion. The digital smart locks on the $1,200,000 coastal Florida estate I had recently purchased for my parents had just been manually overridden. Someone had explicitly entered the master security code, successfully bypassed the encrypted firewall I had installed, and permanently changed the locking mechanisms. My blood ran completely cold, the analytical side of my brain instantly kicking into high gear. My parents were supposed to be boarding an international flight to Europe right now. They could not possibly be at the coastal property in Florida. I quickly tapped the screen to immediately view the high-definition security camera feed from the massive circular driveway. The live video loaded, buffering for a split second before revealing the scene, and my jaw clenched tight. A massive commercial moving truck was backed perfectly into the driveway of the pristine coastal estate. I could clearly see 2 strange men dressed in matching gray uniforms carrying a large, incredibly ugly brown leather sofa through the custom glass front doors. The sheer audacity of this new betrayal ignited a blazing, focused fire inside me. This was no longer a simple family misunderstanding or a bitter dispute over a vacation ticket. This was a highly calculated physical invasion of a corporate asset I legally owned and controlled. I slammed my laptop shut, shoved it into my bag, and grabbed the handle of my luggage. I was no longer going to play the role of the neglected, forgiving son. I was a professional forensic fraud investigator, and my family had just provided me with an active live crime scene. The drive from the regional airport took less than 40 minutes, but my hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. The bright, oppressive Florida sun beat down heavily on the windshield as I merged onto the highway, accelerating past the speed limit while weaving through the afternoon traffic. The entire situation was mathematically absurd. I had personally paid a massive premium to have a high-end commercial security system installed at that house, specifically to ensure my parents felt perfectly safe in their new retirement home. To see those expensive systems bypassed so casually was a direct professional insult. My analytical mind began rapidly processing the variables and calculating the probabilities. Caleb was supposed to be on a transatlantic flight right now, which meant someone else was actively orchestrating this physical takeover on his behalf. I did not need to guess who it was. I knew exactly whose cheap, gaudy furniture was currently being dragged across my expensive, imported hardwood floors. I pressed my foot harder onto the accelerator, the engine roaring as I closed the distance to the coastal community. They had pushed me too far. They had assumed that because I always remained calm, I was weak. They had mistaken my professional restraint for submission. They thought they could simply take my million-dollar property while I was supposedly crying in an airport terminal. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you attempt to defraud a man who makes his living destroying financial criminals. As the highway miles blurred past my window, the deep, exhausting history of my family's financial abuse played out in my mind like a carefully audited ledger. Every debit, every unauthorized withdrawal, every manipulative transaction was permanently recorded in my memory. When you spend your entire professional life tracking the behavioral patterns of white-collar criminals, you start to recognize the exact same toxic traits operating within your own bloodline. The stark, undeniable contrast between my reality and Caleb's reality had been the defining, miserable theme of my entire existence. I remembered being in my early 20s with absolute clarity. I was working brutal 80-hour weeks at a junior accounting firm downtown, barely sleeping, eating cheap instant noodles in the break room, and desperately trying to build the capital required to eventually launch my own intelligence agency. Every single dollar I earned was heavily scrutinized, saved, and meticulously reinvested into my education and specialized professional certifications. I drove a beat-up sedan with a failing transmission and lived in a tiny apartment where the heater rarely worked. Meanwhile, Caleb was 25 years old, living entirely rent-free in my parents' spacious suburban house, and aggressively calling himself an entrepreneur. He had somehow convinced Michelle and Robert that the only way he could secure massive venture capital funding for his ridiculous ideas was if he projected the absolute image of a wildly successful founder. So they bought him a brand new imported luxury sedan. They paid for his custom-tailored suits. They funded his extravagant steakhouse dinners with imaginary investors who never seemed to materialize. Whenever I brought up the blatant, staggering inequality, I was immediately shut down and criticized. I was told by my own mother that I simply lacked creative vision. I was labeled the boring numbers guy, the dependable but uninspiring workhorse who would eventually settle into a mediocre corporate job and fade into obscurity. Caleb, on the other hand, was heralded as the golden goose. He was destined to build a massive tech empire that would elevate the entire family name into the upper echelons of high society. They viewed my grinding labor and financial stability as a basic expectation, a baseline requirement. But they viewed Caleb's mere existence as a divine gift that required constant, unconditional funding. The profound unfairness of the dynamic did not make me scream, and it did not make me throw tantrums. It simply made me cold. It taught me at a very young age to rely entirely on empirical evidence, verifiable data, and legally binding contracts, because familial love was clearly a highly conditional currency that I could not afford to purchase. I turned the steering wheel sharply, taking the exit toward the exclusive coastal community. The manicured palm trees, perfectly paved roads, and expensive golf carts driving past felt like a hollow stage set. I had spent years analyzing how corporate parasites drain healthy companies dry. The parasite never views itself as a destructive force. It genuinely believes it is fully entitled to the resources of the host. My family operated on the exact same psychological principle. I was the host, and they were the parasites, completely oblivious to the fact that they were slowly killing the very organism that sustained their lifestyle. They never stopped to consider the immense stress I carried, or the sacrifices I made to ensure they did not face complete financial ruin. They simply saw my bank accounts as an extension of their own wallets. The drive through the final stretch of the neighborhood was agonizingly slow due to a landscaping crew blocking the road, giving me more time to reflect on the sheer audacity of their current actions. They were actively attempting to steal a $1,200,000 piece of real estate, believing that their status as my parents and brother granted them total immunity from the law. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling a dark, profound sense of finality settle over me. The era of the good, compliant son was officially over. I was arriving at my property not as a family member, but as a corporate entity preparing to aggressively protect its assets from hostile invaders. Understanding the exact psychological mechanics of Michelle and Robert required understanding the absolute textbook definition of cognitive dissonance. In their own minds, they were wealthy, successful, highly respected members of the elite class. They attended the right country clubs, wore the right designer labels, and spoke with the measured, confident cadence of old money. The stark, horrifying reality, however, was that they were drowning in a suffocating ocean of high-interest consumer debt. They had aggressively mortgaged their future, their retirement accounts, and their fundamental sanity to maintain an illusion of grandeur that was constantly on the verge of total, catastrophic collapse. Whenever the crushing weight of their true financial reality threatened to break through their carefully constructed delusion, They utilized a masterful array of psychological defenses to protect their fragile egos. They never directly asked me for money. Asking directly would imply weakness and failure. Instead, they engineered elaborate, highly manipulative scenarios where my financial intervention was demanded as a basic, non-negotiable duty of a loyal son. If a vehicle needed an expensive transmission repair, Michelle would sigh dramatically at the dinner table, lamenting how incredibly unsafe she felt driving it on the highway, and subtly suggesting that a good, successful son would never let his aging mother risk her life in a dangerous car. If Robert's expensive country club dues were several months in arrears, he would angrily pace around the living room, loudly ranting about how the current economy was unfairly punishing brilliant businessmen. He would complain about the corrupt system, waiting patiently for me to step in and silently clear the balance just to stop his incessant complaining. They had successfully, completely convinced themselves that my money was actually family money. Because they had birthed me, provided me with basic shelter during my childhood, and supposedly given me the intellectual foundation for my success, they believed they owned a permanent, non-dilutable equity stake in my entire life. Every single dollar I earned through my firm was subject to their implicit taxation. When I finally bought out my partners and became the sole owner of the forensic accounting firm, they did not congratulate me on the massive professional milestone. Michelle simply called me and asked if my new chief executive status meant I could finally afford to send Caleb to a prestigious networking retreat in Dubai. Their narcissism was a terrifying black hole, consuming all logic, all gratitude, and all healthy boundaries. They did not love me as an individual. They loved what my corporate bank accounts could facilitate for them. And I had let them do it year after agonizing year, out of a deeply ingrained, misplaced sense of biological obligation. I had paid their property taxes, funded their emergency repairs, and quietly settled their outstanding credit card balances, foolishly hoping that one day, my generosity would finally earn their genuine respect and affection. But you cannot buy respect from people who view you as an appliance. An appliance is expected to work flawlessly, and it is only noticed when it breaks down or stops dispensing what is required. As I navigated the final turns toward my coastal property, the psychological profile of my family crystallized in my mind with perfect, terrifying clarity. They were not misguided. They were not simply bad with money. They were active, willing participants in a lifelong scheme of financial exploitation, utilizing deep emotional manipulation to extract maximum capital from their youngest son. The realization was incredibly painful, burning away the last remnants of my childhood innocence. But it was also incredibly liberating. When you finally understand the exact nature of the game being played against you, you can stop playing by their rigged rules. I was no longer bound by the invisible chains of family loyalty, because the family had explicitly declared I was no longer part of it. They had severed the emotional contract at the airport, leaving me free to enforce the legal contract with ruthless precision. Every victim of prolonged financial and emotional abuse eventually hits a definitive breaking point. For some people, it is a massive, life-altering betrayal that shatters their reality. For me, it was a surprisingly small, incredibly specific incident that permanently destroyed the deeply ingrained illusion of being the good son. It happened exactly 2 years ago, right after my financial intelligence firm officially crossed its first major multimillion-dollar revenue milestone. To commemorate the achievement, I had treated myself to a very specific, high-end mechanical watch. It was a masterpiece of Swiss precision engineering, symbolizing the thousands of sleepless hours, the intense audits, and the relentless grind I had endured to build my career from absolute scratch. I wore it proudly to a mandatory family dinner. Caleb, who had just formally filed for his 3rd consecutive corporate bankruptcy that very same week, noticed the watch immediately. His eyes locked onto the polished steel and the intricate dial, and I saw the familiar, toxic flash of deep insecurity and burning, visceral envy cross his face. He spent the entire dinner making passive-aggressive comments about income inequality and how the current financial system unfairly rewarded corporate drones while punishing true creative visionaries. After dinner, while I was generously helping my mother clear the heavy ceramic plates from the dining table, I briefly left the watch resting securely on the granite kitchen island. A few minutes later, I heard a loud, sharp, sickening crack echo through the house. I walked quickly back into the kitchen to find the expensive watch completely shattered on the hard ceramic tile floor. The sapphire crystal glass was smashed into a dozen jagged pieces, and the intricate internal mechanism was visibly bent. Caleb was standing right next to it, holding a heavy, solid marble cutting board. He looked at the destroyed timepiece, then looked at me, and casually claimed it was a simple accident. He said his hand had simply slipped while he was moving the heavy board. But the smug, deeply satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth told the absolute truth. He had deliberately, maliciously destroyed my symbol of success because he physically could not stand the visual proof that I was vastly outperforming him in life. I did not yell. I did not throw a punch. I walked over, knelt down, and carefully picked up the ruined pieces of my achievement. When I confronted Caleb, explicitly demanding he pay for the thousands of dollars in intentional property damages, Michelle immediately rushed into the kitchen to leap to his defense. She physically stepped between us, her face flushed with righteous indignation, shielding her golden 35-year-old child. She looked me dead in the eye and told me I was being incredibly cruel, petty, and hypermaterialistic. She firmly stated that Caleb was under severe emotional distress because his business had tragically failed, and that I was a terrible, unsupportive brother for prioritizing a stupid piece of metal over his fragile mental health. She aggressively demanded that I apologize to him for raising my voice. That was the exact, precise moment the good son officially died inside of me. I looked at my mother, vehemently defending a grown man who had just maliciously destroyed my property out of pure spite, and I felt absolutely nothing. The deep emotional well of familial affection ran completely, permanently dry. I realized with absolute certainty that I could never fix them. I could never earn their genuine respect, and I could only ever protect myself from their endless destruction. I packed up my ruined watch, walked out the front door without saying another word, and spent the entire drive home mentally cataloging every single asset I owned. From that day forward, I stopped looking at them as my family and started looking at them as high-risk liabilities. I erected massive financial firewalls, locked down my corporate accounts, and began treating every interaction with them like a potential hostile corporate takeover. The shattered watch was still sitting in a specialized display case on my office desk, a constant, physical reminder of the exact price of unconditional family loyalty. Which brings me directly to the grandest, most dangerous illusion they ever constructed: the coastal Florida estate. 6 months ago, the inevitable financial catastrophe finally happened. Robert and Michelle's massive, fabricated house of cards collapsed entirely under its own crushing weight. The major commercial banks initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings on their primary residence in Connecticut. Their numerous high-limit credit cards were universally declined, and collection agencies began calling their home phone dozens of times a day. They were exactly 30 days away from being physically thrown out onto the street by the county sheriff with nothing but their expensive designer clothes and their staggering arrogance. They came to me, entirely stripped of their usual haughty bravado, begging and pleading for immediate salvation. I could have let them fall. From a purely logical, forensic accounting standpoint, it would have been the absolutely correct action to take. Bailing out individuals who actively refuse to acknowledge their own catastrophic spending habits is a terrible investment. But the residual guilt of a lifetime of conditioning is incredibly difficult to erase completely, and I did not want to see my parents living in a homeless shelter. So I stepped in. However, I did not just hand them cash to pay off their debts. I am a certified fraud examiner. I do not throw good money into a burning furnace. I executed a meticulously planned, bulletproof corporate maneuver. I established a blind limited liability company entirely under my name and total control. I used that specific corporate entity to purchase the $1,200,000 coastal estate in Florida in pure, liquid cash. My personal name appeared nowhere on the public county property records. To the outside world, the house was owned by an anonymous corporate holding firm. Then I moved my parents in, but I made them sit down and sign a comprehensive, 50-page residential lease agreement. The legally binding lease explicitly outlined that they were standard residential tenants, living in the property rent-free solely by the grace of the corporate owner. The lease strictly, unequivocally forbade them from subletting the house, assigning the property to a third party, or making any structural modifications without written corporate approval. I explained this to them clearly, line by line. I told them this estate was my commercial asset, and they were merely temporary guests living under my strict rules. But their deeply ingrained cognitive dissonance immediately, violently rewrote reality. Because I was their biological son, and because they felt profoundly entitled to my wealth, they internally converted the dense legal lease agreement into a magical deed of absolute ownership. They immediately bragged to all their new wealthy neighbors that they had successfully purchased a luxury retirement home outright. They acted as if the massive property was their ultimate crowning achievement, a testament to their lifelong financial brilliance. And tragically, they assumed they possessed the absolute, undeniable legal authority to hand my million-dollar asset directly over to Caleb the second he demanded it. They thought the lease was just a silly formality, a piece of paper that could be easily ignored because family always supersedes the law. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. I turned my car onto the final street of the coastal community, the massive moving truck now clearly visible at the end of the cul-de-sac. I could hear the heavy diesel engine of the commercial vehicle idling loudly, completely shattering the peaceful silence of the upscale retirement neighborhood. The thick exhaust fumes mingled with the salty ocean air, creating a sickening contrast. I pulled up right behind the truck, threw the gear into park, and took one last, deep breath. I mentally shifted gears from a son who had just been uninvited from a family vacation into a ruthless corporate investigator protecting his high-value assets. I stepped out of my car, adjusting my jacket, and locked my vehicle. The men in gray uniforms were grunting heavily as they tried to maneuver another piece of gaudy, oversized furniture up the pristine walkway. The time for understanding and empathy was completely over. It was time for absolute, uncompromising legal execution. I pushed the heavy custom glass doors open and stepped confidently inside the grand foyer. The cool, air-conditioned air washed over me, a sharp contrast to the suffocating Florida humidity outside. Olivia stood squarely in the middle of the imported white marble floor, looking entirely out of place in her cheap resort wear. She was holding a plastic clipboard in one hand and an iced coffee in the other, aggressively barking orders at the exhausted moving crew. "Be careful with that leather sectional," she yelled at two men struggling under the immense weight of the incredibly ugly brown couch. "It goes right against the far wall by the bay windows in the master suite. Do not scuff the expensive hardwood floors." Olivia possessed the exact same brand of unearned arrogance, toxic entitlement, and deep delusion that her husband Caleb did. She was a professional gold digger who had knowingly married a man entirely made of fake gold, and now she was desperately trying to claim my actual, hard-earned assets to make her pathetic lies real. "Olivia," I said, my voice echoing sharply against the high, vaulted ceilings of the foyer. "What exactly is going on here?" She spun around instantly. Her eyes widened in genuine shock for a fraction of a second before her face violently twisted into a smug, highly punchable grin. "Well, if it is not the angry accountant," she said, casually taking a sip of her iced coffee and looking me up and down. "I thought you were supposed to be crying in an airport terminal right now. Caleb said you threw a massive, embarrassing fit at the check-in counter when you found out my sister got your luxury ticket." I took a slow, highly calculated step closer to her, refusing to break eye contact. "I asked you a direct question, Olivia. Why is there a commercial moving truck parked in the driveway of my property? And why are these men carrying your garbage into my house?" Olivia laughed a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the pristine walls. "Your property? That is absolutely hilarious, Arthur." She flipped aggressively to the second page of her plastic clipboard, ripped off a crumpled piece of paper, and shoved it directly toward my chest. "Michelle and Robert signed the deed over to Caleb yesterday morning before they left for Europe. It is our house now. Michelle said you can come by next week to pick up your boring, sterile minimalist furniture. We do not need your cold aesthetic in our new family home. We are bringing in a real celebrity interior decorator tomorrow to fix this mess." I reached out and took the crumpled paper from her hand. It was a standard, generic fill-in-the-blank legal template clearly printed from a free online website. At the very top, someone had hastily scribbled quitclaim deed in bright blue ballpoint pen. There was no official notary stamp anywhere on the page. There was no raised county seal. There was absolutely nothing connecting this piece of garbage paper to any legitimate real estate transaction. It was legally worthless. And yet, they had genuinely believed it granted them full ownership of a $1,200,000 coastal estate. I stared at the fake deed, fighting the sudden, overwhelming urge to laugh out loud at the sheer, breathtaking stupidity of their master plan. "Olivia," I said, keeping my voice deadly calm and perfectly modulated, speaking to her as if she were a slow toddler. "Michelle and Robert do not own this house. You physically cannot transfer a deed you do not possess." Olivia rolled her eyes heavily, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "Oh, stop being so intensely bitter, Arthur. Your parents bought this place for their retirement. They just decided that Caleb needed the asset more than they did since he is actually trying to build a lasting tech legacy for this family name. You have plenty of money sitting around. You do not need to be so incredibly greedy and selfish all the time. Just let your brother have a win for once in his life." I looked at her, genuinely fascinated by her complete detachment from reality. She was actively standing in my house, ordering strange movers to place her cheap furniture on my imported floors, while aggressively lecturing me about being greedy. The sheer audacity of her statement hung heavy in the air, a testament to the absolute delusion she operated under. "I bought this house, Olivia," I explained slowly and clearly, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum impact. "I paid $1,200,000 in pure, liquid cash for this property exactly 6 months ago. I purchased this coastal estate under a blind limited liability company strictly for tax protection purposes. My name is the only name on the corporate operating agreement. My parents are merely residential tenants. They signed a lease. This piece of paper you just handed me is a complete fraud." Olivia's smug smile faltered just a fraction, and her face flushed a deep, angry red. She stepped forward aggressively, invading my personal space. "You are lying," she spat venomously. "You are just jealous that Caleb is the absolute favorite child. He is already 10 steps ahead of you. He is taking out a $500,000 home equity line of credit against this property right now to fund his new crypto launch. The bank accepted the deed transfer. We own this house. Get out before I call the police for trespassing." The air in the grand foyer suddenly felt completely, utterly still. My analytical mind locked onto her arrogant words, rapidly processing the massive legal implications with terrifying speed. Caleb had not just acted entitled. He had actively, deliberately submitted a forged legal document to a federal banking institution to extract $500,000 in equity from a corporate asset he did not own. My brother was actively committing federal wire fraud and bank fraud from a cruise ship, and his arrogant wife had just handed me the verbal confession on a silver platter. I did not scream at Olivia. I simply pulled my cell phone from my pocket and looked her dead in the eye. "Call them," I said coldly. "Call the police right now. Let us see who leaves in handcuffs." Olivia let out a shrill, piercing shriek of pure indignation. She pulled out her smartphone, violently jabbed the numbers for emergency dispatch, and the exact second the operator answered, she launched into a hysterical, sobbing performance. She cried that a violent intruder had broken into her new home and was threatening her life. 10 minutes later, the distinct wail of sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood. 2 local police cruisers skidded to a halt in the sweeping driveway, their red and blue lights flashing brilliantly against the custom glass doors. The officers stepped out, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy-duty belts. Olivia practically sprinted out the front door, tears streaming rapidly down her face, waving the fake deed wildly in the air and screaming for my immediate arrest. The lead officer, a tall, stern-faced man, took the crumpled paper from her shaking hands. He pulled a penlight from his tactical vest, examined the document carefully, and immediately frowned at the complete lack of legitimate notary seals or municipal tracking numbers. I walked calmly out onto the front steps, my posture straight and my expression completely neutral. I held out my digital tablet to the second officer. I introduced myself clearly and concisely, stating my full legal name and occupation as a forensic fraud investigator. I presented the official state-certified articles of incorporation, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the sole managing member of the LLC that owned the estate. I then pulled up the heavily detailed 50-page residential lease agreement, explicitly highlighting the specific clauses forbidding subletting, signed by Michelle and Robert. The lead officer cross-referenced the digital signatures on my certified documents with the hasty scribble on Olivia's fake deed. The stark reality of the situation dawned on him instantly. He handed the worthless paper back to Olivia. He looked her dead in the eye and informed her in a flat, authoritative tone that residential tenants have absolutely zero legal right to deed a property to another person. He explained that her document was entirely fraudulent. He then pointed a stern finger down the Palm Street and gave her exactly 10 minutes to pack up her garbage and vacate my property entirely, or she would be formally arrested and charged with criminal trespassing and attempting to occupy a home with forged documents. Olivia's smug, entitled facade shattered into a million terrified pieces as the absolute weight of her failure crushed her. The local police cruisers backed out of my sweeping circular driveway, taking Olivia and her shattered, arrogant delusions with them. The massive commercial moving truck rumbled down the Palm Street, retreating from a job that had suddenly become a federal legal hazard. As the heavy diesel engine faded into the distance, a profound, heavy silence descended upon the grand foyer of my coastal estate. I stood alone in the center of the pristine white marble floor, the ambient hum of the central air conditioning the only sound in the massive house. The immediate physical threat to my property had been neutralized, but my professional instincts were screaming. Olivia had mentioned a $500,000 home equity line of credit. Criminals like Caleb do not act in a vacuum. If he was bold enough to submit a forged quitclaim deed to a federal banking institution, he had absolutely left a massive digital paper trail behind him. I walked into the expansive kitchen, set my leather briefcase on the imported granite island, and pulled out my high-performance encrypted laptop. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. The bright Florida sun filtering through the bay windows provided all the illumination I needed. As a certified fraud examiner, my entire career is built on the fundamental principle that every single financial transaction tells a specific story. You cannot move $500,000 without leaving footprints in the digital snow. I opened my secure terminal, bypassed the dual-factor authentication, and connected directly to my firm's proprietary intelligence databases. I began by running a deep, comprehensive background trace on my brother's known corporate entities. Caleb constantly boasted about being a tech visionary, but his actual corporate structure was a tangled, chaotic mess of empty shell companies and defaulted business loans. Within 15 minutes of cross-referencing public banking registries and county property records, I found exactly what I was looking for. 2 days ago, a formal application for a $500,000 home equity line of credit had been initiated at a major national bank. The primary collateral listed on the application was my exact property address. The applicant was listed as Caleb, claiming to be the newly minted legal owner of the estate. I leaned over the keyboard, my eyes scanning the dense blocks of data scrolling across the screen. I could see the exact digital footprint of his breathtaking arrogance. He had uploaded the forged quitclaim deed through an unencrypted online banking portal from an IP address located in a premium airport lounge. He had literally committed federal wire fraud while waiting to board the luxury vacation I had paid for. He assumed that the automated underwriting software would simply glance at the paperwork, see our matching last names, and instantly approve the massive cash injection. He thought he could easily outsmart a highly regulated federal banking institution with a piece of paper he printed from a free legal website. But I knew exactly how bank underwriters operated. I used to consult for them. An automated system might flag the initial application, but any loan over $250,000 triggers a mandatory manual review by a senior title officer. The title officer would pull the official county records, see that the property was firmly held by my blind limited liability company, and immediately flag the quitclaim deed as a blatant, amateur forgery. Caleb had not secured his financial future. He had securely locked himself into a federal criminal investigation. I sat back in the tall bar stool, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. I was not just dealing with a spoiled, entitled sibling anymore. I was dealing with a desperate man who was willing to actively weaponize the legal system to steal my corporate assets. If he was willing to forge a deed for this house, what else had he forged? What other financial landmines had my family buried while I was busy working 80-hour weeks to support them? The analytical side of my brain completely detached from any lingering familial emotion. I was no longer a son investigating his family. I was a forensic accountant dissecting a hostile criminal enterprise. I needed to sweep the entire house. I needed to find out exactly what else they were hiding behind their manicured, wealthy facade. I closed my laptop and began a systematic, highly methodical sweep of the $1,200,000 coastal estate. I did not just look in the obvious places. When you investigate white-collar criminals, you learn to adopt their specific brand of paranoia. A narcissist like my father, Robert, constantly projects an image of absolute, untouchable authority, but internally, they live in perpetual terror of being exposed. They always keep their most damaging secrets close, but hidden behind layers of deceptive normalcy. I walked slowly through the guest bedrooms, the expansive living areas, and the formal dining room, finding nothing but Michelle's expensive, tasteless resort wear and Robert's unused custom golf equipment. I finally entered the massive master suite. The room was bathed in warm afternoon sunlight, the heavy silk curtains pulled back to reveal the sweeping view of the ocean. I paced slowly across the expensive, custom-imported hardwood floors, keeping my eyes locked on the precise alignment of the floorboards. I was actively searching for anything mathematically inconsistent, a slight elevation, a scuff mark that did not match the natural grain, or a microscopic gap in the seamless installation. As I stepped near the entrance of the massive walk-in closet, my shoe caught on a nearly imperceptible, uneven surface. I stopped immediately. I knelt down on the bare hardwood floor and ran my fingertips over the wood. One of the polished planks was completely loose, its edge resting a fraction of an inch higher than the surrounding boards. I wedged my fingers under the edge of the heavy wood and pulled upward. The plank lifted away with surprising ease, revealing a dark, intentionally hollowed-out cavity hidden deep between the heavy floor joists. I stared into the dark space, my pulse remaining steady and cold. Nestled securely inside the hidden compartment was a heavy metal lockbox. It was a rugged, industrial-grade fireproof security safe, covered in a fine layer of dust. Attached to the heavy lid was a small, tarnished brass plaque securely riveted to the metal. Engraved deeply into the brass were my father's initials. I pulled the heavy metal box out from the dark cavity and pulled it into my lap. The mechanical combination dial stared back at me, demanding a 4-digit access code. My father was a creature of absolute, rigid habit. He was deeply predictable in every single aspect of his fabricated life. He lacked the creativity to invent a truly random sequence. I turned the cold metal dial to the numbers of his wedding anniversary. I pressed the heavy latch, but the box remained firmly locked. I tried the year he started his first management job. Nothing happened. A quiet, bitterly cynical realization settled over me. I looked at the dial and spun it again, slowly entering the 4 specific digits that dictated the entire toxic dynamic of our family structure. 0812. August 12th. Caleb's birthday. The heavy internal mechanism clicked loudly in the quiet room. The thick steel lid popped open. The sheer, staggering predictability of his absolute favoritism was almost laughable. Even in his deepest, most paranoid secrets, my father prioritized his golden child above all else. I pushed the heavy lid all the way back, fully expecting to find a stash of emergency cash, or perhaps the vintage family jewelry my parents claimed they had lost years ago. Instead, The safe was packed to the brim with thick, heavily bound manila folders. The paper smelled stale and old, like the damp basement of our childhood home. I reached in and pulled out the very first folder. The label on the tab was written in my father's tight, aggressive handwriting. It did not say Robert. It did not say Michelle. It said my name, Arthur. I frowned deeply, pulling the thick stack of papers out of the folder and into the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the master bedroom windows. These were not simple tax returns or old report cards. They were incredibly comprehensive, highly detailed financial portfolios. I dug deeper into the heavy metal box, pulling out original commercial bank statements, detailed credit reports, and complex loan origination documents. The papers were pristine, perfectly preserved in clear plastic sleeves, meticulously organized by someone who knew exactly how to hide a paper trail. I opened a thick packet from a major national commercial bank, dated exactly 12 years ago. My eyes scanned the top page, and for the first time in years, my heart completely stopped beating. It was a master promissory note for a massive, unsecured personal line of credit. The total approved amount was $150,000. The primary borrower listed on the very first page was Arthur. Printed right below my name was my exact, highly confidential social security number, my childhood home address, and a poorly forged signature that vaguely resembled my own handwriting. My hands actually began to shake as I rapidly flipped through the rest of the staggering documents. The massive line of credit had been fully maxed out within exactly 3 weeks of being opened. I stared at the certified bank transfer receipts, tracking the money as it flowed out of the fraudulent account. The funds were not used for home repairs. They were not used for medical emergencies. Every single dollar had been systematically wired to a corporate bank account registered to Genesis Tech Holdings. I remembered Genesis Tech Holdings vividly. It was Caleb's very first, disastrous attempt at becoming a technology mogul. He was 25 years old at the time, utterly convinced he was the next great visionary. He had rented expensive premium office space, bought luxury corporate vehicles, and completely bankrupted the entire company within 8 months. My parents had sworn on their lives that they never gave him a single dime for that ridiculous venture, claiming Caleb had successfully secured private angel investors. The terrifying truth was staring me right in the face. My parents were the angel investors, and they had violently stolen my identity to fund his entire delusion. A wave of profound, agonizing memory washed over me. I was 22 years old when this fraudulent loan was taken out. I had just graduated from university, working exhausting double shifts to save every penny I earned so I could rent my very first apartment in the city. I remembered sitting in the leasing office, feeling so incredibly proud of myself. The leasing agent had taken my application, run my background check, and then returned to the lobby with a look of deep, profound pity. She handed my application back and told me I was instantly denied. She said my credit score was completely destroyed. She told me I had massive defaulted loans and collections accounts severely damaging my financial profile. I was completely humiliated. When I walked through the front door of my parents' house and told them my credit was mysteriously ruined, my mother had actually laughed at me. Michelle had stood in the kitchen, sipping her expensive wine, and told me I was just financially illiterate. My father had chimed in, saying I needed to be much more responsible like Caleb, who was actively building an empire. They watched me sob at the kitchen table. They watched me struggle for years to rebuild a credit profile I never actually destroyed. They watched me suffer the agonizing, real-world consequences of their federal crimes, and they never once showed a single ounce of remorse. What would you do when you discover that the people who gave you life are the exact same people who actively stole your future? Any lingering trace of familial guilt evaporated from my body entirely. My parents did not just take advantage of my wealth. They actively stole my future before I even had a chance to build it. I gathered the thick stacks of undeniable evidence, placed them securely into my leather briefcase, and pulled out my phone. It was time for an execution. I walked out of the master suite, my footsteps echoing sharply down the long, empty hallway of the house I no longer wanted to own. I dialed the direct, unlisted number for James, my aggressive corporate real estate attorney. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp, professional, and completely devoid of pleasantries. "James," I said, my voice completely flat and carrying the absolute weight of a finalized decision. "Call Vance immediately. It is time to liquidate the Florida coastal property today. Put the commercial listing up within the hour, and tell him we are only accepting pure cash offers for an immediate, non-negotiable close." James paused on the other end of the line, clearly surprised by the sudden, drastic directive. "Arthur, you just purchased that estate 6 months ago. You are going to take a short-term capital gains hit. And what about Michelle and Robert? Are we initiating standard eviction protocols when they return from their cruise?" I walked through the grand foyer, staring at the exact spot where Olivia had tried to claim my empire. "Eviction is far too generous, James. I want this asset completely off my books before the end of the week. Contact Vance. He has been trying to corner the luxury market in this specific zip code for months. Tell him he can have the entire estate, including all the premium custom staging furniture, for a pure cash offer. The only absolute condition is a lightning-fast 7-day closing period." Vance was a ruthless corporate real estate investor who dealt exclusively in massive cash acquisitions. He did not care about family drama. He cared about clean titles and prime locations. Within 45 minutes, James called me back. Vance had enthusiastically accepted the terms. He formally offered $1,300,000 in pure, liquid cash. It was a massive, unexpected premium over what I had originally paid, simply because Vance wanted immediate, undisputed possession of the crown jewel of the neighborhood. James had already drafted the preliminary commercial sales agreement and emailed it to my secure terminal. I opened the encrypted document on my phone, reviewed the strict clauses, and digitally signed my name with a few sharp, decisive strokes. The crisp sound of the digital confirmation pinging on my device was the sound of a heavy steel door permanently slamming shut on my family's unearned luxury. The legal transaction was now in motion, and it was completely unstoppable. However, Vance's massive cash offer came with one strict, non-negotiable condition attached to the premium price tag. The holding firm required immediate, undisputed possession of the property. The massive house had to be completely devoid of all personal residential belongings by Friday afternoon. If there was so much as a single toothbrush left in the master bathroom, the entire $1 million deal would be instantly voided. I had exactly 3 days to completely erase every single physical trace of Michelle and Robert from the coastal estate. I did not waste a single second. I opened my browser and immediately contacted a premium, rapid response commercial packing service based out of the city. I paid a massive, exorbitant premium to have a 12-person commercial moving crew dispatched to the coastal estate that very same evening. I sat on the tall barstool in the kitchen, drinking cold bottled water and coldly orchestrating the total systematic dismantling of my parents' lavish, fabricated lifestyle. The packing crew arrived in 3 large, unmarked box vans. They were efficient, highly professional, and asked absolutely no questions about why they were rapidly emptying a $1 million home at 7 o'clock in the evening. I stood in the hallway with my digital tablet and directed them to pack every single item belonging to Michelle and Robert. I watched with cold, analytical satisfaction as 2 workers carefully wrapped and boxed my father's absurdly expensive, custom-tailored golf clubs. He had bragged for months about how those specific clubs would make him the absolute star of the local retirement country club. Now they were being unceremoniously shoved into heavy-duty cardboard boxes. I walked into the massive walk-in closet and instructed a team of 3 women to clear out every single garment. I watched them pull Michelle's extensive collection of silk resort wear, expensive cashmere sweaters, and high-end designer handbags off the custom velvet hangers. My mother had spent thousands of dollars outfitting herself for her new wealthy persona, using the money she saved by living entirely rent-free in my house. The workers swiftly folded the expensive fabrics and sealed them away in dark, heavy plastic shipping bins. The house was systematically stripped bare of their toxic presence. The premium staging furniture I had purchased remained perfectly in place for Vance's real estate group, but every trace of Michelle and Robert was completely erased from the property. They had treated my home like their own personal kingdom, and now they were being summarily evicted by a team of strangers in matching gray uniforms. I instructed the lead foreman on exactly where the heavy boxes needed to go. I did not send their belongings to a premium, climate-controlled luxury storage facility. They did not deserve luxury. I had actively researched the absolute cheapest, most basic storage options available in the greater metropolitan area. I rented a dingy, windowless $90 a month unit in a rundown, decaying industrial park on the far edge of town. The facility was surrounded by rusted chain-link fences, and the harsh fluorescent lights in the concrete corridors constantly flickered. It was the absolute stark opposite of the glamorous coastal estate they felt entirely entitled to claim as their own. I followed the moving vans across town in my own car. The sun had completely set by the time we arrived at the bleak industrial park. I stood in the cold, damp concrete hallway and watched the crew stack the heavy brown boxes from floor to ceiling inside the narrow, cramped storage unit. Michelle's designer handbags and Robert's premium golf clubs were piled into the small concrete box alongside their cheap souvenirs. The sheer visual poetry of their fabricated wealth being locked away in a cheap metal cage was incredibly grounding. I signed off on the rapid response packing service, handed the foreman a generous cash tip, and pulled the heavy corrugated metal door down with a loud, echoing crash. I snapped a heavy brass padlock through the metal latch and slipped the jagged key into my pocket. The erasure of their physical presence was complete, but Caleb's sheer incompetence still threatened to derail my financial victory. Early Wednesday morning, my phone rang. It was the lead escrow officer handling the cash transaction for Vance's real estate group. She informed me, her voice tight with professional panic, that the title transfer was completely halted. A brand new mechanic's lien had just been officially recorded and attached directly to my property address by the county clerk. The lien was for $85,000, filed by a company called Apex Luxury Pools. While I was busy working, Caleb had brazenly hired a high-end contractor to build a custom grotto and hot tub in the backyard. He had falsely listed himself as the legal managing agent, authorized the massive $85,000 build, and then completely vanished when it came time to pay the mandatory deposit. Now that his bank accounts were frozen by the federal underwriter, the contractor had panicked and slapped a hard legal hold on my property. Vance's corporate group required a pristine, perfectly clean title. If the lien was not legally cleared by Friday morning, the $1,300,000 cash offer would violently collapse. I did not panic. I drove directly to the high-end commercial showroom of Apex Luxury Pools. I bypassed the receptionist and walked straight into the office of the owner, a burly, exhausted man named Paul. Paul immediately crossed his arms, his face flushing with aggressive anger, assuming I was there to make excuses for my brother. He launched into a furious tirade about how Caleb had strutted into his showroom wearing a bespoke suit, demanded an expedited timeline for imported glass tiles, and then ghosted him. I stood perfectly still and let Paul vent his entirely justified rage. When he finally took a breath, I looked him dead in the eye and laid out my terms with absolute cold precision. I introduced myself as Arthur, a certified fraud examiner and the sole legal owner of the estate. I explicitly explained that Caleb had committed blatant contract fraud. He had absolutely zero legal authority to authorize construction on my property. I told Paul that litigating the $85,000 lien would tie his small company up in expensive legal battles for years, and he would likely never see a single dime because Caleb was currently under active federal investigation for wire fraud. However, I offered him an immediate, highly profitable alternative. I opened my briefcase and pulled out my corporate checkbook. I offered to write him a cashier's check for $20,000 right there on the spot. I would pay the missing deposit out of my own pocket to cover his sunk materials and wasted labor. In exchange, he had to log into the county portal and release the lien immediately. But there was one final, non-negotiable condition. I pulled out a sworn legal affidavit my attorney had drafted. Paul had to sign the document, officially stating under penalty of perjury that Caleb had fraudulently misrepresented himself and illegally signed the work orders. Paul read the affidavit carefully, looked at the blank check, and smiled grimly. He signed his name with a heavy black pen. I wrote the check for $20,000 and slid it across his desk. Within 15 minutes, the lien was electronically released. I now had absolute, bulletproof legal leverage against my brother. While I was methodically securing my million-dollar asset in Florida, the absolute reality of their situation was finally violently crashing down on my family in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. On Thursday afternoon, my cell phone lit up on my kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed Caleb's name. I answered the call, fully expecting another barrage of entitled screaming or perhaps more empty, pathetic threats about his imaginary tech wealth. Instead, the voice that came through the speaker was shaking with actual, raw, unfiltered panic. "Arthur, you have to help me," Caleb stammered, his breath catching sharply in his throat. "Please, you have to call the bank. You have to tell them the deed is real." His arrogant bravado had completely, utterly vanished. He was not a brilliant tech visionary or a highly successful cryptocurrency entrepreneur. He was a terrified 37-year-old man whose entire fabricated house of cards had just violently collapsed on top of him. "What are you talking about, Caleb?" I asked, keeping my voice totally detached and perfectly monotone. "The bank froze everything," he gasped, sounding like he was pacing rapidly in a small, enclosed space. "The federal underwriter processing the home equity line of credit ran a deep title search this morning. They flagged the quitclaim deed Michelle gave me. They said the notary seal was missing and the property was officially owned by a corporate entity. They froze my entire account, Arthur. Every single checking and savings account is locked down under heavy suspicion of federal bank fraud. I have absolutely zero access to any money." He was hyperventilating now. "Olivia is crying in the cabin. The ship is demanding immediate payment for the luxury suite, and my cards are all declining. The Greek port authorities will not let us disembark until we clear a $14,000 bar tab." I leaned against the cool marble of my kitchen counter, letting the sheer magnitude of his absolute stupidity wash over me. He genuinely thought a simple, friendly phone call from me could instantly erase federal bank fraud. He thought promising me imaginary future cryptocurrency profits would somehow magically convince me to willingly participate in his criminal enterprise. "You committed mortgage fraud, Caleb," I stated plainly, my voice carrying the weight of a judge reading a sentence. "You submitted a forged legal document to extract $500,000 against a corporate asset you absolutely do not own. The bank did exactly what they are legally required to do when they detect a felony. Just call the underwriter," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "Tell them the LLC is yours and you approve the line of credit. I will pay you back, Arthur. I swear to God, I will pay you back every single cent." He was still living in a complete fantasy world. He had spent his entire life watching our parents bail him out of every single massive failure, and he truly believed I would step in and do the exact same thing. "I am not bailing you out, Caleb," I said, my voice ice cold. "I am not verifying a fraudulent loan. You and Michelle and Robert can sit in that tiny cabin and figure out how to pay your own bills. Do not ever call this number again." I hung up the phone and instantly blocked his contact. I blocked Michelle and Robert as well. They were officially cut off, stranded in Europe with no money and no escape. Friday morning arrived with brilliant, blinding Florida sunshine. The lightning-fast 7-day close proceeded flawlessly, exactly as I had mathematically calculated. Vance's corporate real estate group wired the funds directly to the title company without a single delay or complication. I sat in James's sleek downtown law office, drinking sparkling water and efficiently signing the final stack of closing disclosures. The moment the escrow officer confirmed the massive wire transfer, I checked my secure corporate banking application. $1,300,000 sat securely in my account. The property was officially sold. My parents' massive, sprawling house of lies was completely, permanently gone. I returned to my own quiet luxury apartment overlooking the city skyline. I opened my laptop and methodically, ruthlessly erased their entire existence from my financial ecosystem. I logged into the utility portals and immediately terminated the water, power, and high-speed internet services at the coastal estate. I canceled the premium landscaping contract and the weekly pool maintenance. Then, I officially unregistered my parents' residential lease agreement with the county, completely severing their last remaining legal ties to the property. My final administrative task was the most satisfying. I navigated to the Federal Postal Service website and submitted a permanent change of address form for Robert and Michelle. I did not forward their mail to my apartment. I forwarded every single piece of their mail directly to the dingy, windowless, $90 a month climate-controlled storage unit in the rundown industrial park. Their expensive catalogs, their luxury cruise line brochures, and their inevitable massive past-due credit card bills would now be delivered straight to the cold concrete box that held the pathetic remnants of their stolen luxury. The next 2 weeks passed in blissful, absolute silence. I focused entirely on my forensic accounting firm, securing 2 massive new commercial contracts and watching my corporate accounts grow steadily. I did not think about the Greek port authorities or the frozen home equity line of credit. I slept heavily and peacefully, entirely free from the exhausting, suffocating burden of managing my family's constant manufactured catastrophes. I had successfully excised the tumor from my life, and the recovery was spectacular. I spent my weekends reading, running along the river, and enjoying the profound quiet of a life completely devoid of narcissistic manipulation. I was ready for whatever pathetic retaliation they attempted to launch when they finally dragged themselves back onto American soil, knowing full well that my legal and financial defenses were absolutely impenetrable. On the evening of the 14th day, the Mediterranean cruise officially ended. The blazing Florida sun beat down mercilessly on the regional airport tarmac as Michelle, Robert, and Caleb dragged themselves through the arrivals terminal. They looked absolutely nothing like the wealthy elite they desperately pretended to be. Their skin was peeling and burnt and angry, lobster red from being stranded in Greece without access to their premium indoor cabanas. They were wearing cheap, wrinkled tourist clothing they had been forced to buy with borrowed cash. The sheer humiliation of flying for 14 hours in cramped economy seats next to the restrooms had completely fractured Michelle's fragile ego. They took a cheap, dented rideshare to the coastal estate. When they arrived, Michelle marched directly up the pristine walkway, her posture rigid with toxic entitlement. She reached the massive custom glass doors and aggressively jabbed her personal access code into the digital smart lock. The keypad flashed a harsh, solid red light. She scowled and punched the numbers in again, hitting the buttons with angry, forceful strikes. Red again. The digital lock had been completely wiped. She cupped her hands around her face and pressed her nose directly against the glass to peer into the grand foyer. What she saw completely shattered her remaining grip on reality. The expensive coastal staging furniture she had meticulously chosen to impress her friends was completely gone. The pristine interior had been replaced by unfamiliar decor. Sitting exactly where Michelle used to host her lavish dinner parties was Vance, the corporate investor, sitting with his wife and children around a table, eating delivery pizza. Michelle's mind violently rejected the visual information. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, pounding her fists against the heavy glass doors, demanding the strangers vacate her property immediately. Vance calmly picked up his phone and dialed the police. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers skidded to a halt in the driveway. The lead officer commanded everyone to step away from the entrance. Vance stepped out, completely unbothered, and handed the officer the crisp, newly printed, legally recorded deed proving his corporate firm owned the property free and clear. The officer turned to Michelle and Robert, his expression hardened, and ordered them to vacate the premises immediately or face arrest for criminal trespassing. Caleb, terrified by the police presence and remembering his frozen bank accounts, completely snapped. He scrambled backward, threw his hands up in the air, and began screaming, pointing a trembling finger directly at his mother. "I did not forge the deed," Caleb wailed, his voice cracking with hysterical panic. "She made me do it. My mom told me to sign the papers. She orchestrated the whole thing." He threw his own mother directly to the wolves to save his own skin, completely destroying the family dynamic in front of the entire wealthy neighborhood. That was the exact moment I arrived. A sleek, black town car glided smoothly up to the curb, parking directly behind the flashing police cruisers. I stepped out, dressed in a flawless navy blue suit, flanked by James, my imposing corporate attorney, and Detective David, a senior investigator from the Financial Crimes Division. Michelle's manic eyes locked onto me, and she desperately tried to play the ultimate victim. Her knees buckled, and she dramatically collapsed onto the hard brick pavers, forcing massive crocodile tears down her sunburned cheeks. She wailed that I was a monster, a cruel son throwing his own flesh and blood onto the street after everything they had sacrificed for me. I did not flinch. I maintained my perfectly composed posture. I stepped forward, stopping exactly 2 feet away from her kneeling form. I opened my leather briefcase and handed the massive, 2-inch thick manila folder directly to Detective David. Here is the comprehensive evidence of 12 years of identity theft, wire fraud, and tax evasion committed by Robert and Michelle, I stated clearly. The detective nodded, signaling his officers to move in. Then, I looked down at my mother. I reached into my pocket and retrieved 2 specific items: a single dull brass key attached to a cheap yellow plastic keychain, and a crisp $100 bill. I opened my fingers and let them drop. "Here is the key to your storage unit," I said, my voice echoing coldly across the driveway. "It is Unit 402 at the industrial park on the edge of town. And here is $100 to cover your ride there. After today, you are entirely on your own." I turned my back on them as the officers began reading them their rights. 1 month later, the warm coastal breeze felt entirely different. Michelle, Robert, and Caleb were currently out on restricted bail, facing severe mandatory federal prison sentences and total, inescapable bankruptcy. They were living in a cramped, paper-thin apartment near the industrial park, completely shunned by society. I stood on a pristine stretch of undeveloped beachfront property, unrolling thick architectural blueprints. I had used the massive profits from the sale of their fabricated illusion to purchase this commercial land. I was finally building my own empire, entirely independent, perfectly complete, and totally free. Share your stories of drawing hard lines and protecting your peace in the comments below. If my journey to absolute independence resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of reclaiming your power. Remember, you always have the absolute right to walk away and build your own kingdom.